There is a mistake many people make when they think about respect. They believe respect is something they must ask for, demand, or somehow earn through constant displays of strength. They become louder, they become more aggressive, they try to prove that they cannot be pushed around. But genuine respect rarely comes from proving how powerful you are. It comes from demonstrating that you know your own value and that you are willing to protect it. Think about the people around you. Watch carefully how they treat different individuals. You will notice something fascinating. People rarely treat everyone exactly the same. They test, they observe, they discover what someone will tolerate. If a person makes a disrespectful joke and you laugh nervously, they have learned something. If someone repeatedly cancels on you and you continue making yourself available, they have learned something. If someone interrupts you every time you speak and you never address it, they have learned something. This does not necessarily mean that people are consciously plotting against you. Human beings simply adapt to the boundaries they encounter. Behavior that has no consequence tends to repeat itself. And this is where your transformation begins. You do not need to make people afraid of your anger. You need to make them aware of your standards. There is a profound difference. Anger is temporary. Standards are consistent. A person who explodes whenever they feel disrespected may appear powerful for a moment, but everyone eventually learns that their reactions are predictable. Push the right button and they lose control. That is not real power. It is vulnerability disguised as aggression. The person who calmly says, "That doesn't work for me," and then changes their behavior is far more difficult to manipulate. Why? Because there is nothing to negotiate with. You are no longer asking another person to understand your worth. You are deciding what access they will have to you based on how they behave. This is one of the hardest psychological shifts a person can make. Most people want to be liked, they want to be understood, they want everyone to approve of their decisions. And because of that desire, they become willing to compromise themselves. They explain too much. They apologize too quickly. They accept behavior they secretly resent. They say yes when they mean no. Then eventually resentment builds, and resentment is often the hidden price of having weak boundaries. You tell yourself that you are being patient, but perhaps you are simply afraid of confrontation. You tell yourself that you are being kind, but perhaps you are terrified that someone will leave if you stop giving them everything they want. You tell yourself that you are being understanding, but perhaps you have never learned how to make your own needs matter. There is nothing noble about abandoning yourself to keep someone else comfortable. Real kindness requires choice. If you are incapable of saying no, your yes has very little meaning. This is why boundaries are so psychologically powerful. A boundary is not an attempt to control another person. You cannot control what someone says, thinks, or does. A boundary controls something far more important, your participation. You cannot stop someone from disrespecting you, but you can decide what happens afterward. If someone continually insults you, you can end the conversation. If someone repeatedly violates an agreement, you can stop relying on them. If someone treats your time as worthless, you can stop giving them unlimited access to it. Notice the difference in mindset. The weak position says, "How can I make you treat me better?" The stronger position says, "If you choose to treat me badly, I choose how much access you continue to have to me." That is the beginning of psychological independence. And independence changes the way people perceive you. When people realize that you are not desperate for their approval, your presence changes. You become less reactive. You become less eager to prove yourself. You can listen without immediately defending yourself. You can disagree without becoming hostile. You can walk away without needing the other person to admit that you were right. That calmness creates uncertainty in the minds of people who are accustomed to controlling others through emotional pressure. They cannot easily predict what will make you collapse. They cannot easily manipulate you with guilt. They cannot easily buy your loyalty with temporary approval. And they begin to understand something important. Your attention is not automatic. Your trust is not automatic. Your presence is not automatic. It must be earned. But there is another principle you must understand. Do not announce every boundary. People who constantly declare, if you do this again, I will leave, often weaken their own position when they repeatedly make threats they never carry out. The more powerful approach is quiet consistency. You do not need a dramatic speech, you need a pattern. If someone crosses the line, respond appropriately. If they repeat it, adjust their access. If they continue, distance yourself. Your actions become the message. This is why you should never confuse boundaries with revenge. Revenge keeps you emotionally connected to the person who offended you. You remain obsessed with proving something. You want them to suffer because you want them to understand your value. But the person who truly understands their own value does not need another person to validate it. They simply move differently. They stop chasing. They stop begging. They stop explaining themselves to people committed to misunderstanding them. And most importantly, they stop confusing being needed with being respected. You may discover that some people will become uncomfortable when you develop boundaries. That is not necessarily evidence that you are doing something wrong. Sometimes people become angry because the version of you they benefited from is disappearing. The person who was always available becomes selective. The person who always forgave everything begins remembering patterns. The person who always explained themselves begins speaking less. The person who accepted disrespect begins walking away. And suddenly, people call you different. You are different. You have stopped negotiating against yourself. This does not mean becoming cold. It does not mean treating everyone with suspicion. It does not mean turning every relationship into a power struggle. In fact, the strongest boundaries often make healthy relationships better because both people understand where the lines are. You can be compassionate without being submissive. You can be generous without being easily exploited. You can be forgiving without becoming endlessly available. You can be peaceful without being powerless. That is the distinction you must carry with you. The objective is not to make people terrified of you. The objective is to make disrespecting you an unattractive choice because they know you will not reward it with continued access. Once you understand this, you stop asking, how do I make people respect me? You begin asking a far more powerful question. What behavior am I willing to accept from the people who have access to my life? Your answer to that question will determine the quality of your relationships, the strength of your character, and ultimately the way the world learns to treat you. Now, once you have established that your standards are not negotiable, you face an even deeper challenge: controlling yourself. Because it is one thing to tell people that they cannot disrespect you. It is another thing entirely to remain composed when someone actually tries. This is where many people lose their power. Someone says something deliberately insulting. Someone questions your intelligence in front of others. Someone attempts to embarrass you. Someone ignores a boundary you clearly established. Instantly, something happens inside you. Your body reacts before your mind has had time to think. Your heart accelerates, your face becomes tense. You feel the urge to answer immediately, to prove yourself, to strike back with something even more cutting. And in that moment, you may believe you are defending your dignity. But ask yourself a more difficult question: who is actually controlling whom? If another person's words can instantly dictate your emotional state, then that person has acquired influence over you without needing your permission. This is why emotional control is not weakness. It is one of the highest forms of strength. The disciplined person does not lack emotion. They simply refuse to allow emotion to become their master. There is a crucial distinction between feeling anger and obeying anger. You can feel insulted without becoming insulting. You can feel provoked without becoming reckless. You can recognize disrespect without allowing the offender to choose your response. That small space between stimulus and reaction is where your power lives. Most people surrender that space. They react immediately. They send the message. They make the accusation. They raise their voice. They explain themselves for 10 minutes. And afterward, when the emotion has disappeared, they realize they said far more than necessary. The problem is not simply that they reacted. The deeper problem is that they revealed themselves. Every uncontrolled reaction gives information to the person watching. It tells them what hurts you. It tells them what makes you insecure. It tells them which subjects trigger you. It tells them how easily they can pull you away from your center. And once someone understands your emotional triggers, manipulation becomes much easier. This is why calmness can be psychologically powerful. Imagine someone attempts to provoke you in a public setting. They expect you to become defensive. Instead, you pause, you look at them, you allow the silence to exist for a moment. Then you respond in a measured voice. If you want to discuss the issue seriously, I'm willing to. If you're trying to provoke me, I'm not participating. Nothing dramatic has happened, and yet the entire dynamic has changed. You have refused to enter the emotional battlefield they created. This is important because many conflicts are not actually about the subject being discussed. They are contests over emotional control. One person becomes angry and the other becomes angry. One raises their voice and the other raises theirs. Soon neither person is solving anything. They are simply competing to see who can dominate the emotional atmosphere. You do not have to participate. There is enormous strength in being the person who can remain rational while everyone else becomes reactive. This does not mean you should tolerate mistreatment silently. Silence is not always strength. Sometimes direct confrontation is necessary. But confrontation becomes far more effective when it comes from clarity rather than emotional desperation. There is a difference between saying, "How dare you speak to me like that?" while losing control and saying calmly, "Do not speak to me that way." The words may be simple. The psychological message is completely different. The first communicates that you have been emotionally captured. The second communicates that you have made a decision. That distinction matters. When you are emotionally controlled, your opponent determines the tempo. They decide when you react, how intensely you react, and how long you remain engaged. When you control yourself, you regain the tempo, you can slow the conversation down, you can ask questions, you can observe, you can decide whether the situation even deserves your energy. And this is one of the most underrated forms of power, deciding what does not deserve your attention. Not every insult requires a response. Not every accusation deserves a defense. Not every person deserves an explanation. Sometimes the most intelligent response is to let another person's words reveal more about them than about you. Think about the psychology of insecurity. When someone is desperate to prove that they are intelligent, powerful, attractive, or important, they often become excessively reactive when those qualities are questioned. Their identity depends on external confirmation. But when you have developed genuine internal confidence, you become harder to provoke. You do not need every stranger to understand you. You do not need every critic to approve of you. You do not need to win every argument. You understand that your character is not determined by another person's temporary opinion. This creates a kind of psychological armor. Not armor that makes you insensitive, but armor that prevents every external event from entering your mind and rearranging your emotions. And there is another lesson here. Never make permanent decisions from temporary emotional states. Anger wants immediate action. Wisdom can wait. When you are furious, delay the message. When you feel humiliated, pause before responding publicly. When someone challenges your ego, give yourself time to understand what is actually happening. Ask yourself, what exactly am I defending? Is it my dignity or is it my ego? Those are not always the same thing. Your dignity may require you to leave a disrespectful situation. Your ego may demand that you stay until you have defeated the other person. Your dignity may require a boundary. Your ego may demand revenge. Your dignity protects your future. Your ego often protects your pride in the present moment. Learning to distinguish between the two is a major step towards psychological maturity. And eventually, something interesting happens. People begin noticing that they cannot easily move you. They may disagree with you, they may criticize you, they may attempt to provoke you, but they discover that your emotional state does not belong to them. That creates a different kind of respect. It is not the respect created by intimidation. It is the respect created by stability. People trust the person who remains composed under pressure because they know that person is capable of making decisions when circumstances become difficult. A calm person is not necessarily passive. A calm person may be extremely decisive. They simply do not waste energy demonstrating their strength every 5 minutes. This is the deeper principle. The strongest person in the room is often not the loudest person. It is the person who can remain fully conscious while everyone else is being carried away by emotion. So the next time someone attempts to disrespect you, do not immediately ask, "What should I say?" Ask something more important. Why are they able to control my emotional state? That question turns the situation inward. It returns responsibility to you. You may not control another person's behavior, but you can control your response. You can choose the pace of the conversation. You can choose whether to engage. You can choose whether to walk away. And you can choose whether their attempt to provoke you becomes a source of weakness or an opportunity to demonstrate discipline. The person who controls your emotions controls part of your life. Take that control back. Stay calm, observe carefully, respond deliberately. Once you have learned to establish boundaries and control your emotional reactions, there is one final principle that transforms everything. Your presence must have value, and your absence must have meaning. This does not mean playing childish games, deliberately ignoring people, or disappearing simply to make someone chase you. Those tactics are usually signs of insecurity disguised as strategy. Real power is quieter. It comes from understanding that access to you is not an unlimited resource. Your time is limited, your attention is limited, your energy is limited, your trust is limited. And the way you distribute these things communicates something about what you consider valuable. If you give your attention to everyone, your attention becomes cheap. If you are available at every moment, your availability becomes expected. If you continually forgive behavior that violates your standards, your forgiveness becomes permission. And this is where many people unknowingly undermine themselves. They believe that constantly being present will make others appreciate them more. They answer every message immediately. They accept every invitation. They continue conversations long after respect has disappeared. They repeatedly return to relationships that have already demonstrated their inability to treat them well. They confuse access with connection. But connection is not created simply by proximity. It is created through mutual respect, trust, and reciprocity. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is step back, not to punish someone, not to make them jealous, not to create anxiety, simply because you have recognized that your presence is no longer being treated with the value it deserves. Think about what happens when something is constantly available. We begin to take it for granted. Human psychology adapts quickly to familiarity. What once felt special can eventually feel ordinary. This is why selective availability matters. When you are constantly present, people may stop noticing your contribution, but when your presence is intentional, people become more conscious of it. This principle applies far beyond relationships. It applies to work, friendship, leadership, communication, and personal development. A person who has nothing else happening in their life may spend hours trying to maintain one conversation. A person who has a mission may recognize that the conversation is no longer productive and move on. That difference is profound. Your life should be larger than any single person's approval. When your identity depends on one relationship, one social group, one employer, or one person's opinion, you become vulnerable. The fear of losing that person makes you tolerate things you would otherwise reject. But when you have your own direction, your own standards, your own work, and your own purpose, you become less dependent on external validation. And ironically, this independence often makes people value your presence more. Why? Because you are no longer asking them to complete your identity. You are inviting them into a life that already has structure. That is a completely different psychological position. There is also an important distinction between being unavailable and being inaccessible. Being unavailable means you have priorities. Being inaccessible means you are emotionally closed. You do not need to become cold to become selective. You can care deeply while maintaining boundaries. You can answer someone later without hating them. You can decline an invitation without creating drama. You can leave a disrespectful conversation without insulting the other person. You can distance yourself without announcing it to everyone. This is maturity. The insecure person wants everyone to know when they are withdrawing. They make declarations. They post indirect messages. They tell mutual friends. They want the other person to notice their absence. But if your goal is genuinely to protect your peace, you do not need an audience. You simply change your behavior. And this is where absence becomes powerful. When you withdraw from someone who has repeatedly disrespected you, you remove the reward attached to their behavior. You are no longer available for the same cycle. No argument is necessary. No revenge is necessary. No dramatic final speech is necessary. Your decision becomes the consequence. This is much more sustainable than retaliation because retaliation keeps you psychologically connected to the person. You are still thinking about them. You are still monitoring their reaction. You are still waiting for them to suffer. You have technically walked away, but mentally you are still standing in the same room. True detachment is different. You stop asking whether they noticed. You stop wondering whether they regret it. You stop needing them to understand. You simply move forward. That is when absence becomes genuine power, because your life continues without requiring their recognition. And there is another lesson hidden inside this. Never threaten to leave if you are not prepared to leave. Empty threats destroy credibility. If you repeatedly say, "I'm done," and then return 2 hours later, people learn that your boundaries are emotional performances rather than decisions. Instead, let your actions become consistent. If you say something matters, treat it as though it matters. If you say you will not tolerate a certain behavior, enforce that standard. If someone violates your trust repeatedly, reduce their access. This consistency creates predictability around your values. People know where you stand. And paradoxically, clear boundaries often create more peaceful relationships because people no longer need to guess what you will tolerate. But you must also be careful not to turn this philosophy into arrogance. Your goal is not to make people feel beneath you. Your goal is to refuse to place yourself beneath anyone else. There is a difference. You do not need to diminish another person to elevate yourself. You do not need to dominate every room. You do not need to win every social interaction. You simply need to know what you bring to the table and stop giving it away indiscriminately. Your attention should go toward people and activities that deserve it. Your energy should support your purpose. Your trust should be earned through consistent behavior. Your presence should be meaningful because your life itself is meaningful. And this leads to perhaps the most important principle of all. Build a life that makes walking away possible. If you have no purpose, you will cling to people. If you have no direction, you will chase validation. If you have no internal standards, you will accept whatever treatment is offered. But when your life has substance, rejection becomes less frightening. You can lose a relationship without losing yourself. You can lose a friendship without losing your identity. You can leave an environment without believing your entire world has collapsed. This is the foundation of personal power. The person who knows they can walk away cannot easily be trapped. And when people recognize that your presence is a choice rather than a desperate necessity, the psychological dynamic changes. They understand that disrespect comes with consequences, not because you threaten them, not because you frighten them, but because you are willing to remove yourself from situations that violate your standards. That is the kind of strength that does not require constant demonstration. So look at your own life. Where are you giving unlimited access to people who give you limited respect? Where are you making yourself constantly available because you are afraid that distance will make someone leave? Where are you repeatedly returning to situations that have already shown you what they are? You may not need to become more intimidating. You may simply need to become more selective. Let your presence be intentional. Let your attention be earned. Let your trust develop slowly. And when someone repeatedly demonstrates that they do not value what you bring, do not waste your life trying to convince them. Step back, walk forward, and remember this. The strongest consequence you can give someone who repeatedly disrespects you is not revenge, it is the loss of access to you.